Guten Tag, Damen und Herren. Es freut mich sehr, wieder in Düsseldorf zu sein. Und, die Möglichkeit, mit euch über Morton Feldman zu sprechen. Ich fange auf Deutsch an. Das ist vielleicht eine tollkühne Entscheidung, aber wir werden mal sehen, wie das geht. Und dann später Englisch, die Sie wahrscheinlich besser verstehen würde als mein Deutsch. Ich erinnere mich, dass als jemand Morton Feldman eine Frage stellte, seine Antwort immer Hinweise auf andere Disziplinen enthält, auf Malerei, sehr oft Architektur, Philosophie und so weiter. Und wenn seine Antwort indirekt war, war sie auch immer irgendwie relevant und oft provozierend. Ich möchte also heute auf ähnliche Art beginnen und schlage vor, dass wir einige Minuten nicht debattieren, es gibt nicht Zeit dazu, sondern über Kunst im Allgemeinen nachdenken, und besonders die Problematik der Kunst, was Morton Feldman sehr engagiert hat. Also als ein verunsichernder Vorspiel zum Hauptthema Morton Feldman und seine Musik. Fangen wir mit einem Zitat von einem indischen Philosophen und Politiker, Mahatma Gandhi. Ein Journalist hat Gandhi einmal gefragt, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? Und Gandhi antwortete, I think it would be a very good idea. Und es gibt viele Beispiele in Geschichte, die Gandhis These unterstützen. Aber etwas ist klar, dass bei jeder Zivilisation, ob Ware oder Schein, ist die Kunst einer der größten Schätze. Bei uns in der westlichen Länder, es gibt auch sogar ein Gefühl von Unruhe und Skepsis, wenn es um die Kunst geht. Zum Beispiel, wenn beim Betreten der Tate Gallery in London nicht zumindest einen Moment die Tatsache in Betracht gezogen wird, dass die Ausstellungsstücke durch die Profite der Sklavenarbeit im Zuckerhandel finanziert wurden, Mr. Tate, bedeutet dies einen der wichtigsten Fundamente der westlichen Kunst zu ignorieren. In der westlichen Welt sind aber solche Verdrängungen an der Tagesordnung. Oder stellen Sie sich ein stattliches englisches Haus vor, das Haus einer besonders boshaft Renaissance-Familie, ein prunkvolles Gebäude, in dessen Grundmauern sich die Knochen derer befinden, die unter physischen und psychischen Leiden es errichtet haben. Solche Gedanken führen oft zu einer Art Krise. Man wird von tiefen Zweifeln übernommen. In einem Leserbrief in Guardian-Zeitung steht, nachdem das meiste des ersten Aktes eines Ballettes im Royal Opera House überstanden war, während sich zwei Damen neben mir ununterbrochen miteinander unterhielten, wagte ich eine freundliche Beschwerde. Einer dieser entgegnete, es ist doch nur Musik. Ist darauf noch irgendeine Antwort möglich? Es ist kaum überraschend, wenn Künstler zu einem defensiven Standpunkt anwenden. Als Hans Eisler wurde von dem Haus Un-American Activities Committee gefragt wurde, Mr. Eisler, were you or are you a communist? Antwortete er scherzhaft mit höchst typisch bewundernswerter Intelligenz und Schläue, no, I'm not a communist. The communists are heroes. I'm not a hero. I'm just a composer. Der amerikanische Maler Philip Guston in den 60er Jahren über Vietnam und der Brutalität der Welt schrieb, was für ein Mensch bin ich, hier zu Hause sitzend, Zeitschriften lesend, in einer frustrierten Wut über alles und dann in mein Studio treten, um ein Rot zu ein Blau zu ändern. In der Tat hat Guston eventuell Abstraktion für Sozialrealismus abgeben. Eine politische Kunst ist verlockend, aber die Konsequenzen sind oft unerwartet und schwierig. Eine Tapisserie von Pablo Picasso, Guernica, die den Terror und das Abschlachten von Bask-Zivilisten darstellt, hängt draußen vor dem Sicherheitsrat in New York seit 1985. In 2003 Vorhänge wurden benutzt, um die Tapisserie zu verbergen, während der Diskussion über Irak. Die Vorhänge wurden für einen angebrachteren Hintergrund für die Kamera gehalten. Heutzutage sind die schlechter viel empfindlicher als früher. Aber wir können bezwingende Argumente und nicht nur politische für die Kunst anführen. Was ich jetzt in meinem Gespräch über Feldman demonstrieren versuchen werde, die Kunst liefert keine Wunder wie die Religion, sie bietet keine Lösungen wie die Ideologien, Kunst fordert Verpflichtung und Einsatz, aber sie verspricht nichts. Now, with considerable relief, not only for me but also for you, I will now continue in English. And what I'm going to do is this. Sorry, I keep playing with this. It's a strange thing to. I'm going to talk about. Well, I'm talking about how to play Feldman, what the experience of playing Morton Feldman's music. And so from time to time I shall go to the piano. My talk will be, as it were, interrupted twice by performances of two of his earlier, shorter, relatively shorter pieces from 1952. And then at the very end, no, not at the very end, at the end, I shall play a longer 25-minute piano piece. In fact, the last solo piano piece that Feldman wrote. If there's time after that, and I hope there will be, we can then go into the area of anecdote, and which I think is actually very important. And because Feldman was an extremely amusing and witty man, and many, many stories circulate in the music world about Feldman's famed wit and humor, which could be, in fact, very hurtful and caustic. But I think it would be nice to, perhaps to talk a little bit about that, and I have two examples, one which is a personal recollection and another from somebody else. So in other words, I hope that the seriousness of this event will not be compromised by ending with anecdotal material. Incidentally, in this talk on Feldman, which I'm now going to give, occasionally, where there is a word or a phrase which I probably incorrectly judged to be difficult and maybe not understood by all of you, I shall just quickly give the German translation. I hope this will not be insulting to those of you who may even know English better than I do. So, but I will do that. Just one or two key phrases, words that I want you to understand. I want you to understand as much of this as possible. I've noticed going to these conferences where people read papers, and usually they read much too quickly. They're reading something which they spent 1 year over, to an audience who have never seen it before, and it's always frustrating. You want them to stop, what did you say there? I don't understand, but you can't do that. So I try to avoid that. I shall read slowly and clearly, and I want you to understand every single word that I say, with whatever it's worth. That's something else. And I call this the art of touch, Anschlag, at the piano, and a celebration of contingency. I suppose you could translate as Eventualität, performing the piano music of Morton Feldman. From ancient China, there is a description of a vibrato technique, and I quote, "Remarkable is the ting yin, where the vacillating movement of the finger should be so subtle as to be hardly noticeable. Some handbooks say that one should not move the finger at all, but let the timbre be influenced by the pulsation of the blood in the fingertips, pressing the string down on the board a little more heavily than usual." Unquote. Now, such extreme sensitivity of touch is of the essence in a performance of Feldman's music. In the piano pieces, the depressed key, Taste, is gently eased back to position to minimize the obtrusive sound of the key mechanism. So, you can hear that, but you can't hear that. That's what I mean by key mechanism. But now you can't hear it. So, to minimize the obtrusive sound of the key mechanism, time is allowed for the minutest of harmonics to resound, and at the ends of phrases, fingers steal away from the keys noiselessly and elegantly, like dancers vacating the stage. Listening to Feldman, we have to accustom ourselves to new dimensions, rather like Alice had to in Wonderland. When we have passed through the narrow door and got accustomed to the dim light, we realize the range of Feldman's imagination and the significant differences that distinguish one piece from another. The performer and the listener become aware that the dynamic quality within softness, creates an extraordinary variety. In other words, and this is important, it is not just a question of playing a routine, conservatory-trained pianissimo, however skillfully and admirably controlled. In his early works, Feldman frequently instructs, quote, soft as possible. The relativity of this prescription suggests that the degree and quality of softness depends on both the acoustical and the psychological. How soft is soft as possible? It's a kind of dare, wagen. The great German pianist and teacher Arthur Schnabel used to demand from his pupils, safety last. I recall unforgettable past performances of Feldman by great players at the threshold of silence, of no sound, but alive and vibrant. And when a note refused to speak, the interpreter simply, unhurriedly, had another go at it. So let's listen to a piece of music by Feldman from 1952, one of the earliest pieces. Typically, I've got this in the wrong order. It's called Extensions 3, 1952. It's about 8 minutes, and it's a good example of some of the things I've been talking about. So that was Extensions 3, 1952. With the great Feldman performers, and I can think of two in particular, and in fact, in a way, only two of the really great performers. One was David Tudor, the American. The other, Cornelius Cardew, the English, both sadly dead. They were wonderful players, Feldman. With them, it's the dialectic, if you like, of, on the one hand, the extreme fingertip sensitivity and control, embodying Verkörpern, the notion of intention. And on the other hand, the recognition through an awareness of the contingent, of the ultimate impossibility, indeed the undesirability of control. Intimately, at close quarters, as it were, the performer experiences the vulnerability of intention and the inevitability and acceptance of failure, Versagen. And one is reminded of Samuel Beckett's famous dictum, quote, "No matter, try again, fail again, fail better." Well, there are different ways of dealing with failure. There is the heroic, for example, and there is the fatalistic. And I recall rehearsing a two-piano piece with Morton Feldman in Buffalo in the late 70s. In his striving for pianissimo, he would all too frequently miss notes, especially in chords, but single notes too. At one point, I stopped playing and I gently remonstrated with him. I said, look, you've written these gorgeous chords and we're not hearing them. If you miss a note, why don't you have another go at it? Which he did. Now, I suppose one could say that Feldman had adopted initially a fatalistic attitude to performance, while I was encouraging an heroic, never say die approach. Yet touch, Anschlag, is not all, even in Feldman's music. Certainly in his early music, the balance was in favor of the feel, the weight of the key, the touch. If that was right, it was thought, then the sound would look after itself. But according to Feldman, the very physicality of performing his music meant that although performers were often extremely touch sensitive and knew how to play the sounds, or rather how to perform the actions to produce the sounds, they were not actually listening. So they were not always sensitive to the durations of the sounds or to the pauses between sounds. Perhaps this is one of the reasons which prompted Feldman in his later works to modify his notation so as to have more control of the durations, the pauses, the silences. It was his way of notating rubato, of influencing, if not controlling, a word he disliked, the overall flow of the music. Feldman once referred in a radio discussion to what he recognized in many cases as the professional musician's apparent fear of his instrument. That certainly is the case with pianists. I remember as a student at the college, the piano students were always very frightened of the instrument, frightened of the pieces they had to play. It was just an experience dominated by fear, especially performance, and I suffered from that as much as anybody. We were twisted, tormented souls, leading our lonely lives, we piano players. So, he talked about this apparent fear of the instrument by the professional musician, a fear that creates, as he put it, a distance between performer and instrument. He talked of the need in his own music for a closeness of player to instrument, what I would describe as an at-oneness embodied in a radical commitment, Verpflichtung, to the muscular, physical, and essentially sensual qualities of the art of Feldman performance. With the great interpreters of Feldman's music, one is conscious of the movement, always economical, over and across the keyboard, rather like watching a dance for hands and arms. And what you hear and experience with great intensity is the limb, das Glied, as it performs, or to be precise, the finger pad, that most erotic part of the pianist's body, and the resulting sound is raw and thrilling. In too many performances of Feldman's music, it seems to me that one is somehow all too conscious of a cultural intervention between body and instrument. The great interpreters may be virtuosi, but this has nothing to do with velocity, speed. They are virtuosi by virtue of the extraordinary sounds they draw from the piano. Rather, in Feldman, their virtuosity is a virtuosity of restraint. Their performances steer a dangerous course, generating risk and excitement. The player on the edge, the phrasing and articulation situational, determined spontaneously by a consciousness of the imperfections in the instrument one is playing and the dimensions of the room by ambience, temperature, and acoustical properties, by the idiosyncrasies of individual sounds at particular moments, by an awareness of differing degrees of control and intentionality. With these interpreters of Feldman, the great interpreters like Cardew and Tudor, with these interpreters, the unintended is brilliantly and movingly contextualized. It is this, together with an emphasis on the sensual and physical qualities of the art of performance, which creates an indivisibility, Unteilbarkeit, of musician and instrument, and at best, of Feldman's music and its audience. In the early piano works, Feldman deploys sequences of seemingly, apparently random chance chords. His idea was that the performer should respond to each moment, to the total unpredictability for the audience of each successive chord, that he should be alert, wachsam, in a kind of state of exalted consciousness, so that each ictus chord constituted, as it were, a single, self-contained composition. It is as if the player is tracking the sound, letting it take him or her into new psychoacoustical regions. Thus, the relationships between the chords are contingent upon many factors, not least upon the perceptions of the individual creative listener. Occasionally, successive repetitions of a single chord or phrase appear in the early music, notably and memorably in Extensions 3, which you heard with the, for example, the repeated F-sharp octaves near the beginning, and Intermission 5 from the same year, 1952. Feldman's intention here, I believe, is simply to freeze the music in order to give weight and focus to a single chord or phrase. The Swiss composer Klaus Huber made a thought-provoking observation after a performance I gave of Intermission 5, which I shall play now. At the very end of the piece, as you will hear, there is a short phrase which is repeated 9 times. I try to make each repetition the same as the preceding one. Huber observed that on this particular occasion, they were not only the same, but more the same as the preceding one. I suppose what Huber meant was that this exceeded the listener's expectations of what sameness means. What is the sameness of one phrase followed by another? How sameful, that's not a word, I've just invented it. How sameful is that phrase in relation to the last one? So you have expectations, and if those expectations are exceeded, then Huber's phrase about makes sense. In trying to exceed those expectations, you are acknowledging, in fact, that everything is different. Anyway, I'll play that so you can experience that yourself. I often feel that even in prestigious institutions like this one, where I have the privilege of being now, that there is a tendency to debate experience rather than experience experience. Do you know what I mean? People talk about experience. They debate and discuss and write essays about it. But then you ask, what about experiencing the experience? Oh, what's that? Well, that's what we should do now. We should experience the experience of Feldman's music. And it's the ending, when there are these 9 phrases, which I shall attempt and probably fail to make exactly the same. Fail better will be my intention. Intermission 5, 1952. Incidentally, the instruction here, no secrets from the audience, it says slow. In the previous one, it was slow, as soft as possible. Nothing about that. Slow, hold, sustaining, and una corda pedals throughout. So although there are a few loud chords, as you will hear, in fact, according to Feldman, you keep the una corda pedal sustained, as at the very beginning. feel better. Well, there's an interesting point about this that I should draw your attention to in the notation. Some of the sounds, I think, were appreciably softer. And actually, he does notate quite frequently in this piece notes which are grace notes. Verzierung, I think is the word, isn't it? Sometimes these grace notes, tiny notes, are written just before the next bar, takt, but in which there is no note. Sometimes they are written actually on the beat, so to speak. And sometimes you can, why don't I just go through, look, you can see, you see that there's, if you just look at those, it doesn't take long, you can see, so just glance at that score and you can see what I'm talking about. See the grace notes, some are on, some are just before the bar. There we are, just see those grace notes. If I was really well organized, I would just press a button and there would be something appearing on that wall, but I'm not. Okay, it's not really necessary to see it. It can be easily described. But that does obviously present an important, it's an issue for the performer to, I think, to make those differences. The listener doesn't know that the piece is notated in that way, so one has to make a different quality to those sounds, to the extent that on one or two occasions there, more or less, I think they was just there, I almost missed them completely. There's a recording of Feldman playing this piece, and all you hear in the whole recording is the loud sounds. No other sound can be heard at all. Nothing, just the loud sounds and then complete silence. He used to play, he was a very big man, and he used to play and with very short-sighted. He used to sort of play like this, hunched over the piano, play like this, play another sound, which of course could not be heard, and another one, then down there, and then he'd go like that. People will be astonished, I know. Sit there, of course, with due reverence, listening to him play. But I guess he gave the right idea, in a way, of what he meant. In rehearsal, he used to talk about sounds being sourceless, which of course is very difficult on the piano, but one can always try. So repetition, which you heard there, is one of the formal characteristics of Palais de Marie, which is the piece I shall play at the end, Feldman's last solo piano work. The repetitions are sometimes immediate and sequential, but more often through the deployment of the same musical material throughout the whole piece. And in this last piano piece, the last one he wrote, the one I should play, one hears these even octave transpositions of material with this wonderful, unerring sense of register. I always think this is very important. It's obvious, really, very important for a composer of the piano to have an impeccable, faultless sense of register, and one or two composers have it. Feldman was one of those. So, in Palais de Marie, there is none of the rhythmic complexity which characterizes much of the late work, rather a simplicity and refinement, a paring down of the musical material to a limited number of pitches of tonhöhe, which also appear in octave transpositions, what I've just said. Towards the end of the piece, the grace notes, we come back to this idea, the Verzierung, become more insistent at the end of Palais de Marie, which you will hear. They become more insistent, more often, more frequent, I should say. And in the final section, are elongated, made longer into eighth notes. And these rising sevenths gently propel the music upwards and away, floating through an immense space. Feldman described Palais de Marie as a distillation of all the piano music he had ever written. So it's a good piece to listen to. Now, I recall an occasion in Graz, Austria, performing Feldman's Triadic Memories, a work lasting around an hour and a half, beginning early evening in a reasonable light, but which was beginning to fade. And the concert accompanied, enhanced by the changing light. The only artificial light was a lamp. The concert ended in near darkness. Towards the end of the performance, bells, Glocken, from a distant church provided a miraculous counterpoint, a merging of art with everyday reality. And at a stroke, the monstrous egotism of the artist, in this case, composer and performer, Feldman and me, is punctured, l'idiot, undermined. And the music could no longer say simply, listen to me, nor could the performer demand of his audience, look at me. The world as musical composition. This was the effect of these bells. But there is something more about this performance in Graz. Because what the unforeseen occurrence of the bells that evening in Graz signifies, it seems to me, is a moral dimension which is encapsulated in the words of the English author, philosopher Iris Murdoch. She wrote, and I quote, "Moral change comes from an attention to the world whose natural result is a decrease in egoism through an increased sense of the reality of, primarily of course, other people," unquote. To express this idea a little differently, to do something constructive, you have to look beyond yourself. The entire world is your sphere if your vision can encompass it, umfassen. But self-expression lapses too easily into mere documentation. I recall, this is how I feel. Listening to Triadic Memories on that day, Graz, two women, one young, one elderly, were weeping, weinten. I mention this not least because I think it is a rare occurrence at concerts that people weep. And I can only speculate on the reasons. But I believe they have something to do with meanings in Feldman's art that I've already touched upon. Human vulnerability and fragility. In the late works, the enveloping hugeness of Feldman's canvas reminds one of the great Mark Rothko black paintings. There too, in the Rothko Chapel in Houston, people sit and quietly weep. In a BBC radio discussion, I remember the interviewee postulieren, the inadequacy, Unzulänglichkeit, of art in relation to the awesome power of nature and natural phenomena. Kant, too, had called into question the primacy of the experience of art in relation to the experience of nature. Perhaps then it is the kinship, Verwandtschaft, of Feldman's music with nature rather than with art. Its aspiration to nature, like the Rothko works, which is able to generate this emotional response, the weeping, in people. Significantly, Feldman would never talk about compositional reality. In fact, he said there was no such thing. He preferred to talk about acoustical reality. Now, what I'm going to do now, that's the end of that formal presentation. So now we're going to hear the last work of Feldman's for piano solo. Not the last work completely, but the last work he wrote for piano solo. I think it was 1986, so it's a year before he died. Palais de Marie, for which I would like to ask somebody from the audience to turn the pages. I could do it myself, but I think it's better if somebody does it for me. So if anybody could do that. So we'll need another chair. Shall I take that one? Thanks. Don't worry, it's not, I mean, I shall give you, whoever does it, I shall give you a clear indication. And it's very simple. You don't even have to read music for this, although I'm sure you all can. Oh, you volunteered. Thank you, sir. I know it's a terrible chore. It's a boring chore, but it's very kind of you. Okay, so we'll just have a little practice here. You can talk amongst yourselves while we... Okay, so is that all right? So it'll be like that. This is a problem here of that happening, but I think it should be okay. So it's quite a dangerous job. I'll give you a sign. It's very slow. Okay. Let's move it over a bit, I think, shall we? Like that. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, we have some time. Maybe I hope this, if I go straight into the anecdotes, I hope this will not compromise the seriousness of what we've been talking about and doing, and also the, irrespective of the playing, could be better, could be worse, but the beauty of this music. But I think these things do tell you something about Feldman. I've already indicated something. I've indicated something of his bulk, huge bulk, as to use another phrase of Beckett. Huge bulk, massive. The short-sightedness, and the devastating wit. Well, I remember one occasion. This was a personal recollection, which I suppose is now part of the Feldman canon. I was preparing for a performance at the BBC of some of his music, and I think it was a Sunday afternoon. I can't remember. It was an afternoon anyway. And he turned up, and he said, "Come on, let's go and have tea." I said, "No, I must practice. You know, I'm playing this. It's got this recording today at the BBC, a performance concert. I must practice." He said, "No." He said, "You're okay. You know it. Don't worry. You just come with me." He said, "Come, let's go and have tea. You know, relax. Have a nice afternoon." I said, "No. I can't do it. I must stay. I've got to practice. I've got to prepare the stuff and play it properly." He said, "Look, John," he said, there's a couple of broads outside waiting for us." And a broad is a very vulgar word for women. He said, "John, there's a couple of broads outside waiting for us." I said, "Morton, I'll be right with you." He said, "John, you're a true musician." So that was... and the other one, which is also to do with women, who were extremely fond of Feldman. And there was one occasion when he had the manager of Universal Edition, the managing director of Universal in London, was a very charming English gentleman called Bill Colleran. And Bill was the archetypal sort of suave gentleman. And if you went to his house at any time of the day, he'd be there in a silk dressing gown, with a cigarette holder. "Come in, dear friend. Come in, my boy, and have a sherry or something." He was always in this silk dressing gown. And apparently one day he and Feldman got on very well. They were sort of chalk and cheese, but they were very, very good pals. They really liked each other very much. They were very close friends. And one day, apparently, Bill Colleran said to Feldman, he said, "But Morton, he said, this, you seem to be very attractive to the ladies, I don't understand because you're so incredibly ugly. You're so ugly. So ugly, Morton." He said, and those, your legs, and those varicose veins on your legs. He said, Feldman said, "Bill, when they see those, it's too late. So, but there are many sort of stories about him, and often he had this kind of charisma, which attracted people. Interestingly enough, he was asked once, because he'd met many artists, many people from different walks of life, and he was asked once who he considered to be the three most charismatic, I guess, artists or people, artists probably, he'd ever met. And the three he named were Cornelius Cardew, the English composer who died, Edgar Varèse, and Samuel Beckett. They were the three. And he said, no, wait a minute. He said, I'll put Varèse and Cardew in first place or something like that. I think he positioned them. But those were the three that he rated very highly. There's a very funny story, I don't know if you ever read this, of how Beckett and Feldman first met. They met in a darkened cinema when Feldman wanted to approach Beckett about the possibility of collaborating on an opera. Beckett hated opera. He gave him one line, which he actually said, and there's a piece of music, an opera by Beckett, which is one line, about shadows and moving in and out. I can't remember exactly. And it was a very funny story because they were in the dark, and Feldman was very short-sighted, and basically they just fell over each other. They bumped into each other. They were both fell on the ground in this dark cinema. They couldn't see, and Beckett was on the ground. They were all on the ground. That was the way they first met, knocking into each other in a darkened cinema, and then getting up and finding their way somewhere. And Beckett was very formal. He said, Mr. Feldman, I don't like opera. I really don't like opera. And Feldman said, I know, and nor do I, but this. And then he said, Beckett said, well, I'll think about it. And apparently later, a year later or something like that, I can't remember exactly, Feldman received a postcard from Beckett with just this one line. Some of you who know what's it called, the opera? What's it called, the Beckett opera, the Feldman opera? It's just a soprano screeching. It's not very nice. It's a soprano in the high tessitura screeching away for about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. Much worse than Evato. And we got just this line, very beautiful line of kind of poetic line, which he used and said. So that was a deal with Samuel Beckett. But if there's anything you wanted to comment on about Feldman, about his music, we have a little time. So now is the time to do it, and I can sort of step back a little bit while perhaps some of you may want to comment or ask or on Feldman. And you can ask, of course, in German or any other language, I guess. Why not? I'm always happy when there's no questions. It's always the sign of a successful day when nobody has anything to say. It's when people feel cheated. They have to compensate by talking. Think, oh God, how do we rescue this terrible morning we've had? Let's talk. And so it's a kind of form of rescue, a rescue act, damage limitation. So if nobody says anything, I think this is probably a good idea, a good thing.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
Vielen Dank, dass Sie gekommen sind. Ich hoffe, es hat Spaß gemacht. Und dann würde ich sagen, bis zum nächsten Mal.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.